Now, let's talk a little bit more about diet and let's move beyond the we call macro war, meaning the proportion of macronutrients, protein, fats, carbohydrates, whether it is the 40-30-30 or high protein versus low carbs. It's just distraction. What I mean is that macros, the macronutrients, are not necessarily irrelevant, but they are pretty much a blunt tool, right? Two diets can have the same macros and completely different effect on the body depending on the calorie intake, food quality, protein source, fiber, and what they do to the body's nutrient sensing system, things like mTOR, AMPK, insulin growth factor 1. So I want to cover in this section 4 thoughts. Number 1, calorie restriction versus diet quality. Number 2, the protein controversy, why both sides have a point. Number 3, carbs, insulin signaling, and longevity. And 4, we'll talk about nutrient sensing pathways, what they are, why people overhype them, and what we can responsibly say from human evidence. So let's start with the biggest one, looking at the animal research, and that's calorie restriction. In multiple species such as worm, flies, rodents, reducing calories without causing malnutrition tend to extend lifespan and delay age-related disease. Now, that's real in animal trials, but humans are not lab mice, right? Humans live in messy real life, and we don't get to run controlled 40-year trial where we randomly assign people to at least eating 25% less for decades and then wait to see who lives longer. So what do we actually have in humans? Well, the best human trial here is called Calorie, Comprehensive Assessment of Long-Term Effects of Reducing Intake of Energy. Now, in this Calorie trial phase 2, healthy adults, mostly young to middle-aged people, not obese, they were randomized to calorie restriction target of about 25% versus usual eating for 2 years. What happened in the real world is quite important. People didn't hit the target of 25% calorie restriction long term. Wonder why, right? Who wants to walk around constantly hungry? So, on average, they achieved roughly about half of that, say about 12% restriction. And they maintained the weight loss that they achieved through that for about around 10%. Now, what did that buy them, right? Now, across the 2 years, moderate calorie restriction improved multiple cardiometabolic risk factors, things like blood pressure, LDL cholesterol, and markers that are tied to insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome risk. Now, this was published in the Lancet Diabetes and Endocrinology. So, if we are asking, does eating less, moderately less, improve risk markers that predict future heart disease and diabetes, then we can say that in this population, yes. But the more interesting question is, does it change aging itself? That's what I want to know, right? So that's where the 2023 follow-up analysis comes in, and it was published in the Nature of Aging. For their analysis of the data, they used DNA methylation-based measures, basically pattern of DNA that correlates with biological aging. Now, these tools are unfortunately imperfect, but They are one of the few things that we can measure over just a couple of years. So what they found was very subtle. Calorie restriction slowed the pace of aging as measured by one algorithm called Dunedin pace. Unfortunately, it did not meaningfully shift several other clocks that measure the biological age. In other words, there was a signal, but it wasn't a huge signal, and it wasn't consistent across all methods. That's the kind of result that I personally take seriously. Modest effect, not magic, and not uniform. So here is probably the most honest framing when we look at these results. Calorie restriction in humans appear to improve health risk markers, such as cholesterol, blood sugar, and so on, in at least some settings, right? It also may modestly slow measurable pace of aging signal in some analysis, but we do not have a proof that it extends human lifespan because those trials would take decades, right? Now, the next question is always, is it safe? Is calorie restriction safe? So in the Calorie trial, they tracked safety in pretty serious way. One concern that comes up frequently when we are looking at these studies that doing the calorie restriction is concern about bone density. Now, there was a calorie bone analysis in Journal of Bone and Mineral Research looking at bone metabolism and bone mass density changes over the 2 years that the trial was running. Now, this matters because if you lose weight, especially if you are already lean, you can lose also bone density. Now, the key point is not calorie restriction destroys your bones. The point is there is a trade-off space here, and bone outcomes need to be modified in real humans, not just assumed, right? Another concern people have is mood, sleep, quality of life, libido. Now, the Calorie trial also published results on this, and interestingly, 2 years of moderate calorie restriction did not show the physiological collapse that critics sometimes fear that these kind of diets may have. In that analysis, it looked more like modest improvement in some areas rather than being it harmful. So what do I take from this? If you are trying to influence long-term aging risk, avoiding chronic overeating is probably more important than chasing some extreme calorie restrictions. The quality of what you eat is everything, in my opinion, because cutting calories isn't the same thing as getting good nutrition, right? When most people hear the word calorie restriction, they think it just means eating as little as possible. But that's really not the goal at all. The real trick is to give your body less total energy while still making sure that you are covered on every single vitamin, mineral, and proteins that you need to stay strong. If you just cut calories but end up with vitamin deficiency, you are not actually fighting the aging process. You are just suffering from malnutrition with fancier name. So for most people, the practical way to do this is not about eating 25% less calories for the rest of your life. It's more simple than that. It basically means that you have to make sure that your calories don't slowly creep up after year, and that you are basically keeping your waist size and all the health markers, right? We're talking about cholesterol, blood pressure, blood sugar, in a safe, healthy range. Essentially, you want to pick foods that give you the most bang for your buck by packing as many nutrients as possible into every bite of food that you take. The big goal is to avoid keeping your body in a constant growth mode, right? We want to trigger those internal sensors that tell your body to stop building new things for a moment and start repairing and cleaning up what's already there, not just constantly building, building, building. Now, let's talk about protein intake and the controversies that surrounds it. Now we are getting into sort of the most annoying topic in longevity nutrition because protein has two very real roles that pull in opposite direction. Role number one is protein supports muscle. And muscle, as we know, is not only cosmetic. We already talked about it. Muscle is a metabolic organ. It's tied to glucose control, strength, mobility, fall risk, and independence. But the second role that protein has, especially certain amino acids and certain sources of protein, is that it activates growth signaling pathways, including IGF-1, insulin growth factor 1, and mTOR. And growth signaling is, unfortunately, double-edged sword. You want growth signaling when you are building, repairing, training, and recovering. But chronic high growth signaling is one of the things that's tied to faster aging biology in model organisms, at least. So both camps are sort of responding to something real. So what does human evidence say about protein and longevity? Widely cited paper here is Levine and colleagues in Cell Metabolism in 2014. In their study, they looked at associations between protein intake, IGF-1, and mortality. And what they found is something that got summarized in kind of oversimplified way online. So their result, speaking broadly, was that higher protein intake was associated with higher mortality in midlife in their particular data sets, and lower protein intake was associated with lower IGF-1. But, and this kind of matters, the pattern differed by age. And the paper itself discussed that older adults may not show the same relationships. And we already talked about it, that folks over the age of 65 may need more protein. So this was not a randomized trial. It was only observational. That's also a big point. That means that the confounding factors played a big role. For example, people who eat high protein may differ in many ways from people who eat lower protein. We're talking about things like smoking, exercise, body weight, food quality, and so on. But this is still a meaningful signal that we cannot just ignore because it's consistent with the idea that the right protein intake may depend on age and the context, not necessarily specific ideology. Now, another key piece that helps reconcile the chaos is protein source, right? In 2020, JAMA Internal Medicine published a large cohort analysis that looked at plant protein versus animal protein. And they reported that the higher plant protein intake and replacing some animal protein calories with plant protein calories was associated with lower overall and cardiovascular mortality. Again, it was observational study, not a trial. But The direction is, again, consistent with other dietary pattern research. So a cleaner way to talk about protein is to talk about how much protein, what kind of source of protein are we talking about, for what age group, and is the person doing any kind of resistance training exercise or not. So let's talk about older adults, right? For older adults, the concern shifts. The problem in older age is not that your insulin growth factor, IGF-1, is too high. The problem is usually loss of muscle and strength. So the sarcopenia that we talked about, frailty, reduced reserves, right? And calorie restriction without enough protein can make that worse. So there are expert group recommendations and guideline documents that argue that older adults often need more than just the basic RDA of 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And again, we kind of touched about it in the previous section. More specifically, the PROTH study group recommends at least 1 to 1.2 gram per kilogram per day of dietary protein for adults over the age of 65 with higher intakes in some condition and also with exercise. Now, that's not, again, a randomized trial of longevity. That's a recommendation that's focused at preserving function and lean mass. Now, we have solid proof from science that eating more protein, especially if you are lifting weights, helps you keep your muscles and stay strong. Large scientific reviews that looked at hundreds of different studies at once show that adding protein can help you gain strength in almost any situation. But the exact results depend on things, again, like your age, how much you were already eating, and how hard are you training. If you are not training hard enough, eating too much protein or eating more protein than what your body really needs can actually be harmful. But again, there's lots of different opinions on that, and I'm not trying to say that one side is better than the other. This is what we have seen from different research that has been done. So, what's the best way to actually use this information practically? Based on the information that we have at this point, it seems like that if you are in your 40s or 50s, you want to avoid going to extremes, right? We shouldn't fall into the trap of thinking that more protein is automatically better for us. It's really important to look at where that protein is coming from. When we look at long-term data on thousands of people, diets that focused more on plants tends to look safer for your heart and long-term health. But as you get into older age, not getting enough protein becomes actually a real danger. At that stage of life, focusing on higher protein targets is actually a very good idea, especially if you are doing strength training. You need that extra protein to protect your muscle so that you can stay independent and keep moving. So don't forget that trade-off. If you increase your protein by cutting out fiber-rich plants, it can actually cause problems for your blood sugar and your heart. I want to be very clear about this. When people argue about high protein versus low protein, they often ignore what that looks like in real world. For many people, high protein diet just means eating more processed meats and bad fats while skipping out on beans, whole grains, and fruits. Then, when they have health problems, the protein gets the blame. But the real issue was really the entire pattern of eating that caused them to get these negative outcomes. Okay, now let's talk about carbohydrates, insulin signaling, and how it ties to the discussion on longevity. So in many health discussions, carbohydrates are often treated as if they are sort of a poison. But looking at nutrition only through the macronutrients like protein, fat, and carbs is, again, kind of a blunt tool that is missing the necessary precision. To understand how carbohydrates truly affect the longevity, which is how long and how well we live, right? Not necessarily the total number of years we live. We must look at several specific factors. These factors include the total amount of carbohydrate that we consume, the specific quality of those carbohydrates, how they influence insulin exposure over a lifetime, and what other essential nutrients, such as fiber-rich plants, are being replaced by processed sugars and flour. So a major piece of epidemiological research, which is a study of health patterns in large population, was published by Siedelman and colleagues in the Journal of Lancet Public Health in 2018. Now, this study used data from ARIC, atherosclerosis risk in communities. Now, this was a meta-analysis, basically a study that combines results from many other studies. And the researchers identify a U-shaped relationship between carbohydrate intake and the risk of death. What this means is that both people who ate very few carbohydrates and those who ate very high amount of carbohydrates had higher risk of mortality, while the lowest risk was found in people who ate moderate amount of some carbohydrates, somewhere around 50 to 55% of their total energy intake. Now, it's important to understand the limitations of this data because observational studies can show us connections. But what they cannot do is they cannot strictly prove that carbohydrates were the direct cause of the health outcomes. Low carb in these large groups does not necessarily mean a strictly controlled ketogenic diet, since in this case, the low carb diet simply describes a general eating pattern. Now, it's also important to mention that high carbohydrate diet can look very different depending on if the person is eating refined grains and sugar or if they are eating whole foods like legumes and vegetables. Now, one of the most informative parts of the Silderman study was the substitution analysis, which looked at what people ate when they reduced their carbohydrate intake. The researchers found that when the carbohydrates were replaced with animal-based fats and proteins, the risk of death actually increased. However, when the carbohydrates were replaced with plant-based fats and proteins, the risk of death decreased. This suggests that the health impact of a diet is not just about the percentage of carbohydrates, but about a specific type of food that make up the rest of the diet. That's sort of like the key point. So the connection between carbohydrates and the aging process is mainly tied to insulin signaling and metabolic health. Insulin, as we already mentioned, is a vital hormone that acts like a key to help glucose enter our cells so it can be used for energy. So insulin itself is not bad. The problem occurs when a person has chronically high insulin exposure, which is often driven by insulin resistance, carrying excess body fat around the internal organs, our visceral fat, right? And a lifestyle with too many calories and not enough physical activity. Now, a metabolic environment with high insulin is strongly linked to increased risk of heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and fatty liver disease. Now, these conditions cause additional complications that shorten person's health span, which is the part of their life spent in good health, right? Different from lifespan, which is the amount of years that we live. Therefore, the best strategy for carbohydrates and longevity is not necessarily to avoid them entirely, but to focus on maintaining healthy body fat and keeping the clinical markers like the hemoglobin A1C and triglycerides, as well as the HDL cholesterol, in the good ranges. Even though the caveat, the HDL is little less important based on most research studies as we used to think 5-10 years ago. Now, ultimately, the goal is to eat carbohydrates that come packaged with natural fiber and micronutrients while avoiding liquid sugars and refined flours. Now, this may help to explain why very low carb diet sometimes looks like they are harmful in long-term data. But it's often not because the carbohydrates are magic, but because those specific eating patterns sometimes lead people to eat more processed animal products and fewer fiber-rich plants that are necessary for long-term health. Now let's talk about nutrient sensing pathways, the mTOR, AMPK, and IGF-1. This is sort of mechanistic sort of part that some people love to turn into religion. What I mean by that is, yes, these pathways are real, they are not made up, but they're often used badly. So let's talk about them a little bit. Let's start with the mTOR. mTOR is your body's build and growth switch, right? When it's on, your body gets the message, hey, we have plenty of fuel and the building blocks, let's build. That helps with repair and rebuilding. So mTOR is not bad. The issue for longevity is when mTOR is pushed high all the time, day after day. This constant activation of mTOR pathways prevents the body from initiating autophagy, the vital cellular cleanup process, where the cells break down and recycle damaged components to maintain systemic health and longevity. Now, the biggest driver of this sort of throttle isn't actually calories. It's protein, especially the building blocks called amino acids. In fact, much of the benefit that people usually attribute to eating less or being on those calorie-restricted diet may actually come from lowering these protein signals rather than just lowering calories. Now, it's also important to talk about the fact that not all proteins push the throttle equally. The amino acid leucine is one of the strongest on signals for mTOR. It is found in high concentration in dairy, particularly in whey protein. This makes sense biologically because milk is a system designed to turn on rapidly growth in baby animal. However, blasting that same maximum growth signal all day long as an adult can prevent the body from entering a protective maintenance state. Now, beyond protein, certain fats like palmitic acid, commonly found in meat and dairy, can also keep the mTOR throttle running hot. Now, It's important to clarify that the answer is not extreme calorie restriction. Long-term starvation is not realistic for most people and come with significant health downsides. The more practical approach is signal management, right? Instead of constant overstimulation, the goal is to stop treating every meal as maximum growth signal. So, if you want to dial down the mTOR throttle in your daily life without doing any extreme, there are three primary ways how you can do it. Number one, change the pattern of protein signaling, right? If every meal and snack is a high protein hit, especially from dairy or whey, you are repeatedly flipping the build switch on, right? A longevity focus pattern means eating enough protein to maintain your metabolic sync, right? Your muscle, but avoiding the non-stop barrage of growth triggers that keep the system from resting. The second is adding cooling foods, right? Quotes cooling. Certain foods acts like brake on the mTOR throttle. Vegetables from the broccoli and cruciferous family are the leaders here. Now, compounds formed during digestion, such as the sulforaphane and DIM, have been shown to help suppress the activity of mTOR, and that helps to balance the growth signal. And third, utilize specific beverages. Now, research suggests that coffee can help lower mTOR activity. Most people do drink coffee. Interestingly, studies show that decaf actually work almost as well as regular coffee, which suggests the benefits come from the plant compound themselves, not just from the caffeine. Now, green tea is another powerful tool for those who don't drink coffee, for example, like myself. Green tea, its primary antioxidant compound is called EGCG, and this compound can actually suppress the mTOR at levels that are easily achievable through daily drinking of green tea. Now, you may hear people discuss longevity drugs like rapamycin to target this pathway, and it's been tried by some people. However, the current scientific consensus is that these are not ready for routine use. There are lots of side effects, and there's still a lot that we don't know about these medications to use them for this purpose. We don't have the proper dosing figured out. As I said, the side effects can be very significant. And again, there's simply not enough human evidence to justify using them purely as something for anti-aging purpose at this point. So the practical message for our longevity update is pretty much not treating the mTOR as an enemy. We need it for repair, recovery, and maintaining our muscle mass, as we discussed earlier. But we also don't want to push that throttle of mTOR to the floor all day long with constant high leucine amino acid hits to our system, right? The goal is to age slower by knowing when to grow and when to let the system rest and repair. Now let's talk about AMPK. While mTOR is the throttle for growth, AMPK, adenosine monophosphate activated protein kinase, is your body's master fuel gauge. It is a highly sensitive energy sensor that constantly monitors sort of the battery level of every cell. When your cellular energy is running low, AMPK will flip on and shift your biology away from making new things and towards energy efficiency, right? Fuel burning and deep cellular repair. So why is AMPK important for longevity? Well, AMPK is the bridge between your environment and your longevity genes, sort of. When AMPK is activated, it triggers autophagy, the cellular cleanup, the process that we already mentioned, and that happens by inhibiting mTOR. So AMPK, when AMPK is active, mTOR is getting deactivated. It also activates sirtuins, which are proteins that help repair DNA and protect your genome. So by keeping AMPK active, you are essentially telling your body to clean the house and fortify the structures rather than just growing and consuming. So how can we activate the AMPK signal? Well, you can trigger this repair mode through several evidence-based lifestyle interventions. So number one is vigorous exercise. That's the cheapest one, right? And this is actually the most potent activator of the AMPK. When you move, your molecules use ATP, right, the energy units, and create increase in AMP. This shift in energy ratio is the direct sort of on switching for the AMPK. Now, high intensity interval training is especially effective because it creates a rapid, significant energy demand. Now, fasting and calorie restriction is another way how we can activate AMPK. When you stop eating for a period of time, your insulin level drops and your cellular energy, basically the stores of your cellular energy, decrease. This signal, the lower energy reserves in your cells, tell the AMPK to start burning more stored fat and recycling old cell parts for fuel, basically, so that the whole system can keep running. Now, next way of activating AMPK is through cold exposure. Immersing our body in cold water or spending time in cold air forces our body to generate heat through thermogenesis. Now, this process is very energy intensive and it has been shown to activate AMPK in both muscles and fat tissue. Now, another way of activating AMPK is through dietary means. We call them the AMPK boosters, right? So specific plant-based compounds can actually act as metabolic mimetics, meaning they can help flip the AMPK switch even when you are not fasting or exercising, and that's why they are sometimes called dietary restriction mimetics, right? Because you can achieve the same effect that you would get from going on, for example, intermittent fasting without the fasting itself by eating some of these things that we will talk about. So the first one is quercetin. There's a compound that's found in high concentration in red onions, capers, and apples. It's a polyphenol, and it is documented AMPK activator that has been shown to help improve mitochondrial function. Another one is my favorite, berberine. This is a compound that's found in herb called golden seal, which is very bitter, and usually is used for things like treating certain infections. It's been combined with echinacea and marketed as herbal antibiotic. I don't know if I would go that far, but it has antibacterial properties. But Usually as an herb, we use it only for a short period of time. It's not really recommended to use it long term. But what we can use long term is barberry, which are small fruits found in many Mediterranean markets. So the berberine is a compound that is also effective at activating the AMPK, and human trials often compare the metabolic impact of consuming the berberine primarily and hopefully in the form of food, not really extracts, to diabetic drug metformin. Obviously, if you want to go that route, then yes, you may need to use the extract, but that would not be my personal choice because I'm always wary with using extracts. It's just something that's too concentrated for one, not something that I believe is natural. And also, it's kind of hard to unless you really, really know the manufacturer and you have some results of third-party lab testing, if you really are getting what you are paying for and what the label says. So that's why I always prefer to go with the real fruit, and I use berberine almost every day in my shake. Don't even know it's there, and I think it's a much better way to get it into our diet. But moving on, another compound is anthocyanins. And these are the dark pigments in blueberries and blackberries. The anthocyanins have been shown to stimulate AMPK, which again helps your body manage blood sugar more effectively, because that's what also actually berberine is doing, okay? Besides many other things, such as also lowering cholesterol. But back to AMPK. What actually suppresses AMPK? Well, the biggest enemy of the AMPK repair signal is chronic nutrient surplus, actually. When you are constantly eating, especially high sugar and high fat food, your cellular energy, ATP, is always high. And we said that we need lower energy intake, or basically energy depletion, to stimulate the AMPK pathway, right? So these high energy intakes basically mute the AMPK signal and keep the body in constant state of storage and growth. Now, high insulin levels also actively suppress AMPK, which is why chronic snacking and high glycemic diets can prevent your body from ever entering the repair and cleanup mode. Now, let's talk about IGF-1. IGF-1 is a build and growth signal in your body. It's a hormone that tells your cells to divide, your muscles to repair, and your bones to stay strong. It's mainly triggered by two things: growth hormone from your brain and the protein and total calories that we eat. In many animal studies, like with mice, having the lower IGF-1 levels is linked to living longer. Because of this, some people think that less is always better. Well, in humans, it's not that simple. Research shows that a U-shaped relationship, meaning if your IGF-1 is too high, you might face higher risk for certain diseases. But if it's too low, you face different risk, like frailty. Now, you might also hear people say that growth signals like mTOR or IGF-1 are bad and recovery signals like AMPK are good. Now, they try to hack their diet to keep basically the IGF-1 as low as possible to live forever, quotes, right? But your body actually needs to grow and repair itself to survive. You do need IGF-1 for building muscles so that you don't lose strength as you grow older. You need it for immune function, so your body can fight off sickness. And you also need it for bone density, so your bones don't become brittle. If you push these growth signals too low for too long, you don't get anti-aging, you get frailty, which is one of the biggest risks for your health as you get older. So the more, you could say, mature way to talk about these pathways is to focus on balance. You want pulses of growth signaling when it is appropriate, like, for example, after resistance training or when you are rebuilding tissue. You also want periods when the body is not constantly in growth mode, like the time between meals or during overnight fasting. This is why the idea of constant grazing or snacking all day is problematic, even if your total calories look fine. When you eat protein, especially in large amounts or when you are in calorie surplus, that raises your IGF-1. While plant-based proteins are often emphasized in longevity diets because they generally result in lower, more stable IGF-1 levels compared to high animal protein diets, the timing and the total amount of the protein we consume still matter. And it actually doesn't really matter, based on several studies, whether we consume animal or plant protein in high amounts. Both of them will result in increased level of IGF-1. Now, high protein intakes or eating too many calories all day keeps that growth signal on, turning on basically constantly. By giving your body time between meals and solid overnight fast, you are allowing the IGF-1 level to drop so that your cells can switch into the repair mode. Now, lifting weights or doing body weight exercises creates a temporary spike in growth signals, which is good stress. That tells the IGF-1 to go specifically to your muscles and bones to make them stronger. So don't try to live in constant state of low growth. Instead, we should aim for a rhythm. Basically, to use exercise and protein to trigger growth when we need it, and use fasting and calorie control to give our body break when we don't. Now, let's talk about what do the human data say about manipulating these pathways through our diet. So when we look at how our bodies handle growth and aging, we have to be very careful not to just copy what we see in the lab mice, right? In the experimental animals. In simple lab animals, just cutting back on calories almost always drops their IGF-1 levels and helps them live much longer. But in humans, the story is more complex. If you just eat fewer calories but keep your protein high, your IGF-1 levels often stay stubbornly right where they are, right? They don't really move much. A major study in the journal Cell by scientists Longo and Panda pointed out that humans simply don't mirror exactly rodents in the labs. This means that if someone tells you that simply eating less will automatically flip your longevity switch and shut down the growth pathways like mTOR, they are oversimplifying the science. Now, while cutting calories does help your heart and metabolism in the short term, it doesn't always lower the specific growth hormone unless you also change what you are eating. So, the real secret to managing these pathways lies really where your nutrients come from, especially your protein. Human data shows that protein intake is the main sort of instrument for the IGF-1 stimulation. Now, the source of that protein matters really tremendously. Research suggests that plant-based protein, like those found in beans, lentils, or nuts, don't spike the IGF-1 the same way as animal proteins do. This is likely because plant proteins have different balance of amino acids, particularly lower levels of methionine and leucine, which are the specific building blocks that tell our body to grow, grow, and grow. So by focusing on plant-based diet, you can maintain your muscle mass while keeping those age-relating growth signals at a much calmer and safer level. It's not just about avoiding meat. There's nothing wrong with eating meat here and there or in smaller amounts, but it's about filling your plate with fiber-rich, nutrient-dense plants that keep your blood sugar stable, since both extremely low carbs and extremely high carb diet can be linked to shorter lifespan. Now, especially talking about the simple carbs. So when I'm talking about putting more fiber and carbs on a plate, I don't mean white rice and white potatoes. Now, our lifestyle habits outside of the kitchen are just as important for controlling these pathways, because instead of trying to starve ourselves into longer life, which can actually make us frail and weak, we should instead use exercise as our primary tool. Now, resistance training like lifting weights or body weight exercises is the cleanest way to go to basically earn our growth signals, right? When we exercise, we tell the body to send those growth hormones specifically to our muscles to repair them, rather than letting those signals float around and potentially fueling aging in other cells. This creates a healthy cycle where you stay lean and strong without having to stay in constant state of hunger. So to put this into daily routine that actually works, the goal is to avoid carrying too much extra fat around our midline, which causes inflammation and messes with our hormones. We also want to keep our protein at the level that support our age and how much we move, but also trying to get as much of that protein from plants as possible. Now, again, I personally don't believe that we should be afraid of carbohydrates as long as we eat the right type of carbohydrates and staying away from the refined sugars and processed flours that basically cause our insulin to spike and trigger those growth pathways unnecessarily. But again, complex carbohydrates that comes with ton of fiber. I have plenty of them in my diet every day, and I got no issues with weight. I got no issues with cholesterol and any of those things. And again, it's not just looking at the carbohydrates, but looking at the whole lifestyle, moving after eating, choosing the right foods, the right proportion. Those are the main things. So this balanced approach, where we are really focusing on plant-based quality things, consistent movement, and avoiding a constant calorie surplus, is the real difference between following sort of mature longevity science and just falling for some internet trend.